So this session is about fair use in open educational resources. I got interested. I should say who I am. My name's Josh Bullock. Until very recently, my title was scholarly communication librarian at KU Libraries. But as of Monday, uh, a week and a half ago, I think, I have become the head of the David Schulenberger Office of Scholarly Communication and Copyright, and I'm going to be hiring a librarian um, to do open education work actually. And so copyright and fair use have just been deeply woven into my professional experience so far. Um, I see them as applying to both teaching and research and in open educational resources. Um, and our orientation in my office is um, that copyright includes the concept of fair use. And so, like a strong copyright system doesn't merely protect the rights of creators to the exclusion of the rights of users, it also protects the rights of users to contend with copyright protected content, to engage with it in critical ways, commentary, parody, and other educational uses, ways that the law itself recognizes as valid. And so we say that we are bully on fair use in that, like, we're surrounded by fair use on a daily sort of way. That's an esoteric concept that I hope will be a little less esoteric as this presentation goes on. But I got interested in fair use in OER in particular um, because there's some hesitancy even within the open education community to embrace fair use in OER, that everything in an open textbook, for example, should itself be openly licensed. But even as some parties have taken that position, they have also coexisted with fair use in OER that they kind of were ignoring or not paying attention to. And I'm not suggesting that there was any malice or, um, you know, um, like stupidity in that at all, but that we just don't think about all of the ways that fair use is integrated into our daily lives and particularly in the academy. So, like textual quotes, for example, that's an example of fair use, and you can find textual quotes in many open textbooks that are part of like the open textbook library, for example. But if you have an image in the same book, often people will want to know, like, what's the deal with this image? Is this openly licensed? Like, how are you using this, and what does that mean for a downstream user? Is it complicating, um, like the if someone is adapting an open textbook, for example, like just lack of clarity on how to engage with that. And then, like yesterday, I had a session in the afternoon about open education platforms. And one of the things that was in my slides was screen caps of various platforms so that I could talk about them. And our slides are openly licensed. So, like, that's another example of the compatibility of fair use with openly licensed content that many of us already sort of use in a mundane way without worrying about it at all and without suffering any consequences for it. Like, these are normal uses that don't result in an avalanche of fair use litigation or like copyright litigation, right? So so what we'll do here is just kind of I'm going to use there's a document called the Code of Best Practices for Fair Use in Open Educational Resources, and we'll talk about that as a sort of as a great resource that can be used to help illustrate these concepts. So um, I I should always make this disclaimer when I'm talking about these things. I am not a lawyer, and nothing I say can or should be construed as legal advice. I'm not here to provide legal advice. I provide information and resources, and every users are all ultimately responsible for their own decisions. So just keep that in mind. So I mentioned this document, the Code of Best Practices for Fair Use in Open Educational Resources, and rather than reinvent the wheel, I've based this presentation directly on this document. It's one of many similar codes of best practices for fair use in various contexts. There's one for documentary filmmakers. There's one for research libraries. There's one for fair use in the visual arts. There's a number of them, and all of them have been created, at least in part, by some of these folks at American University and the Washington College of Law. These folks are lawyers, and they've developed this process of extensive consultation with disciplinary communities to develop these documents. So it doesn't carry the force of law, but it provides some generally accepted structure for informing decisions about fair use in OER based on community practices and understanding and legal knowledge. So this is an excellent resource that you should definitely consult if you're putting these ideas into practice, and it is free. I find it by Googling fair use best practices OER. It's easily discoverable. It is licensed with a Creative Commons attribution license. So essentially, the code is OER about applying fair use in OER, if you want to think of it that way. To be extremely clear, I am not an author on this document, and I don't have any creative sort of control or ownership of it, but it's perfect for this purpose, and I want you to be aware of it as a resource. I have interacted with some of these folks. Will Cross is a close collaborator for several years on an unrelated project, and I've co-presented with Meredith Jacob and Peter Yazzie at different points, but our worlds overlap. But you know, I don't want to claim any make any claims to this document that I shouldn't be making, because I'm not a creator on it, but we can use it in this context, and it's helpful to do so, I think. So because copyright and fair use are generally, I think, pretty poorly understood and closely connected, as I mentioned, fair use is a provision of copyright law. It's part of the US Code. It makes sense to foreground discussions of fair use and OER with a very quick overview of both those concepts, copyright and fair use. So copyright is a form of protection. It's just one of several types of intellectual property. Other types are trademarks and patents, and to a certain extent, trade secrets. It protects for a limited time original works of authorship, and that's based on the historical origins of copyright, which are anchored in the written word, but modern context has expanded to a number of formats, and which can be said to be authored. They're referred to as a body of rights, or sometimes a bundle of rights, and we'll get into sort of those things. But I think copyright could be understood as the rights of creators, but there are limitations that are built into copyright to balance that. So copyright is complex, and I could spend this entire 40 minutes or 90 minutes if needed, if I had it, to dig into that. But here's some really basic fundamentals. It protects things like written works, images, cartography, audiovisual works, and these kinds of things. Did I mention choreography? Text, poetry, novels, etc. It it doesn't protect things like ideas, phrases, slogans, names, data, facts. These are things that just aren't subject to copyright protection. It's automatic. It's created the instant that it's fixed in a tangible form of expression. So like if I express an idea, I don't own the idea. I own the particular expression of my idea as fixed in that tangible form. That may mean writing. It can mean typing. It can mean taking a picture, like hitting the shutter button on a camera. Those are examples of fixing. And what my lawyer friends say is that copyright follows the pen, which is to say that copyright is sort of being created as something is coming into existence. So like as you're writing with a pen, the sort of that's becoming protected. Copyright protection is sort of happening as the ink is flowing on the paper. The rights of copyrights, you see this all rights reserved language frequently, include the right to create copies, to distribute those copies, to create derivatives, and to perform and display in public. It lasts a very long time. The life of the author plus 70 years, that's since 1978. I was born in 1978. I did some back of the envelope kind of math. So if I live, these are my slides. I own the copyright in these slides, let's say. And if I live a normal white male American lifespan, then I've got another roughly 35 to 40 years, and these slides will be protected by copyright until 70 years after that, which is something like 2150, which is it's 105. It was like 105 years from now. So maybe it was 20, 22, 21, 25 or something like that. It's a long time, and in a lot of cases, I think we could be critical of why why do my slides need to be protected for the next 105 years? They arguably do not. And finally, it's exclusive, as in the rights of the copyright holder belong exclusively to them, but there are limitations on that exclusivity, and one of those limitations is fair use. So fair use is defined, and this is language from copyright.gov from the US Copyright Office, as a legal doctrine that promotes the freedom of expression by permitting the unlicensed use of protected works in certain circumstances. This section of the law provides the statutory framework for determining whether something is fair use and identifies certain types of uses, such as criticism, commenting, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research, as examples of activities that may qualify as fair use. Just that because you're doing these things doesn't automatically mean you can do whatever you want, that the use is fair. We still need to be critical, but those are the sort of contexts that the law recognizes as aligned with fair use. So fair use shouldn't be understood to be a copyright violation that is okay because of certain reasons. It should be understood to be non-infringing to begin with. It's permitted by the law for the purpose of freedom of expression. We engage with fair use on a daily basis, perhaps even hourly in our work and in our lives. And these are just some of the most common examples. Direct quotations, screen captures I mentioned in my introduction, news media, both traditional as well as this sort of parody media that is increasingly visible in our cultural landscape. Search engine thumbnails are examples of fair use. GIFs and memes that reference popular television and film are examples of fair use. These are just like, we don't think about these things too overtly, but once you recognize them for what they are, you can see that we're surrounded by this robust system of fair use, and that court cases challenging them are relatively uncommon, in the sense that there are thousands and thousands of these things every day, and litigation, there is litigation, but not nearly on the scale of the use. So I think it's useful to think of fair use as a scale that balances the rights of creators with the rights of others to contend with their creations in certain circumstances. So copyright exists to protect the rights of creators, but that has to be balanced with the public interest, and this is done through exemptions or exceptions to the law, such as fair use. So in this Venn diagram, you can see on the left the rights of copyright holders, and on the right the sort of normal legal uses of copyrighted material by non-rights holders. Mostly these are about consumption, reading a book, watching a movie, that sort of thing. But in the middle, there are some instances that are considered non-infringing. So the definition above mentioned the statutory frameworks, and so these are called the 4 statutory factors that are on the screen here. Fair use should be considered in these terms. So this is what a judge would evaluate whether a use is fair or not in the sort of context of. The purpose and character of the use, the nature of the copyrighted work, the amount and substantiality of the portion taken, and the effect of the use on the potential market. And then this 2-part test at the bottom of the slide, this isn't part of the law, but it's something that lawyers who advocate for robust fair use rights have developed based on course law since the early 90s, where if you look at that fair use case law, you see that where uses are transformative, that in the overwhelming majority of those cases, the uses were found to be fair. And that if the use was not transformative, then often the opposite happened. So you've got transformation is related to the first factor, the purpose and character of the use. But the idea is it transformative, and is the amount used appropriate to the use? And if the answer to these two questions is yes, then courts have for 3 decades been increasingly recognizing that as tending to be fair. Um, a lot of people get confused around the relationship between plagiarism and copyright. You can't just provide a citation to something and then do whatever you want with it. Providing attribution doesn't clear the copyright concerns. It's a good practice, like that's integrated into the way that we research and teach. It's well aligned with academic norms, but they citation and copyright are addressing different issues. So I think the best way to think of this is that copyright is a legal phenomenon and plagiarism is an ethical or a professional violation. And so we have responsibilities to both, to be thoughtful about our actions regarding copyright, as well as providing attribution, in order to be clear about contributions and whose arguments are coming from where. So I think it's useful to think of intellectual property in terms of a continuum. On the left, we've got all rights reserved. That's the default sort of status that you see on everything. On the right, you've got the public domain, which is materials that are not protected by copyright or no rights reserved. And we tend to think of I've got an animation in this slide. Okay, good. Wasn't sure that was going to work right. So we tend to think of OER as happening in this space for things that are in the public domain or released under a Creative Commons license that permits their reuse and repurposing. But what people who are advocating for fair use in OER are pointing out is that limiting fair OER to these two categories ignores the potential for copyright protected content to better meet the needs of instruction and learning outcomes and students. And that if we ignore that completely, we're not taking full advantage of fair use as a provision in the law that is intended to help support that sort of thing. So um, Okay, but why fair use in OER? So the code, which it's not an overwhelmingly complicated document. Um, I'll tell you more about that in a second. So I encourage you to read it, but it cites several examples. One of them is accessibility, that a lot of a common practice is rather to incorporate, they use the word inserts. So rather than incorporate an insert protected by copyright into OER, that there's a practice of linking out to it. But if that link out isn't accessible, then we're abrogating our responsibility to meet the needs of all of our students. And we have an obligation to meet the needs of all of our students. And so we need to take ownership of that and ensure that we're not creating an accessibility problem by providing a link. Plus, links rot, things come off the internet, and so on. Another one is accuracy and authenticity, the accuracy to update content as needed and to accurately reflect the knowledge about a topic by using authentic materials. This is common in language learning, where the best way to teach a language, I gather from my colleagues who do that work, is not to create artificial examples of culture, but to use actual culture from that language. So newspaper articles, television shows, short clips from short stories or novels or poems and that kind of thing, to have the students engage with legitimate, real, authentic culture as a vehicle for the best learning about that language. There's concerns about the efficacy of materials if we don't acknowledge the possibility of fair use as a way to make the best OER that we can make. And then concerns about equity. If we're only using what is openly licensed, then we're sort of defaulting to the demographic and sort of privilege makeup of people who are aware of open licensing and applying Creative Commons licenses to the culture that they create, and that isn't necessarily a representative group. So to get into the code itself, um, the introductory front matter is really useful. There's some clearly explained context of sort of what, why, and how. What is this resource and why? Why is it useful? Why did they create it? The code. So this document is called the code, and then within it there is the code itself. And the code itself, so there's the code and the code within the code. The code itself is 4 circumstances or situations with a description, and each has a principle, considerations, and hard cases, or like particularly challenging cases where they're urging caution. And then there's a 5th bit of it that is about signaling fair use, how you indicate that you're depending on fair use. So the first situation is using inserts as objects of criticism and commentary. And you're gonna be able to tell that I'm reading because I want to make sure that I get this right. So the description in this section notes that educational materials, including OER, often depend on outside content to enable analysis, critique, and commentary. And so, for example, if you were critiquing gender and sexuality in science fiction in a film studies course, the best way to do that is by looking at those dynamics in actual films. The principle states that including inserts for critique and commentary represent non-controversial instances of fair use. If an OER is addressing a text, image, or other object directly, there is no equivalent pedagogical alternative to including that item. The considerations are sort of like, if you're doing it, then make sure you're thinking about these things basically as a risk mitigation strategy, are limiting inserts to those that are being directly examined, including annotations or reflection questions where appropriate. The use should be quantitatively and qualitatively appropriate, so no more or no less than is necessary. And where multiple inserts are used, they should draw from a number of sources. They should be attributed, which is not a requirement of the law, but doing so is consistent with academic and ethical practices. And so they recommend attribution throughout the code for all of these different scenarios. The hard case that they mention is OER anthologies, like a contemporary poetry reader, where the whole thing is essentially materials protected by copyright put together in a reader, and the fair use case there isn't as clear. And so that's a situation where they're not saying you cannot do that, but they're urging a greater degree of caution in thinking about how you would do that and if you could do that. But they're still leaving the ability to consider it on the table. The second example is inserts for illustration purposes. So the description for this use case notes that inserts from various sources and media are regularly incorporated into teaching materials for illustrative use to anchor what is being taught in tangible examples. So I have a colleague at KU, Dr. Brad Osborne, who's an associate professor of music theory, and Brad created an OER for music video analysis, which he uses lots of images, because you can't talk about music videos are by and large all protected by copyright, and you can't teach how to analyze them without referring to the rhetoric within the images and the videos themselves, right? So he's got an image, for example, of the electronic music duo Daft Punk to illustrate musician persona in music videos and how they create and construct that. The description in the code further notes that the function of the inserts is to reinforce and enrich the pedagogical narrative of teaching materials rather than to function as objects of critique. Also, typically, illustrative inserts were originally created in non-educational contexts, such as journalism, entertainment, or scientific documentation. So there's the idea of transformative use. And their learning value is closely associated with their authenticity, so they cannot be effectively recreated. There's not a replacement that you could use in this setting to fulfill the same goal. Um, so the principle states that for the purpose of illustration, fair use supports the incorporation of thoughtfully selected inserts in all subject areas. The considerations are being prepared to explain the intended significance of an illustrative insert in the context of OER where it appears, avoiding merely decorative use. So not just making the slides pretty or the a textbook look better, but it's anchored in what the content is about. Um, Using what is quantitatively and qualitatively appropriate in light of the pedagogical relevance, drawing from a range of sources, and providing attribution. They also note that some text and images may not be protected if they're factual in nature because copyright doesn't protect facts. So like if you're using um, a a table of scientific recorded data, observation data, that might not be protected by copyright and might not even need to be considered as fair use. The hard case suggests that introducing chapters in a history text with adorable baby animal pictures unrelated to instruction may not count as fair. So it's got to be content appropriate, not just making the page look more entertaining. Um, the third situation is incorporating content as learning resource materials. So the description for incorporating inserts in this context notes that students often engage with content to build analytical skills, familiarity, or fluency. And this practice-based learning is greatly enhanced if those resource materials accurately reflect what they will encounter outside of the classroom. So for example, you might have journalism or political science students view clips from various media coverage to learn about bias and spin in news media. The code notes that by their nature, inserts of this kind are likely to be protected by copyright. Further, the purpose of this sort of thing is promoting mastery by supplying students with essential opportunities to practice their skills and deepen their insights. As in the last example, these materials are often created for the purposes other than educational use. They always should be contextualized to enhance their value as learning resources. So the principle here is that resource materials suited to the learning objectives of an OER may be incorporated in reliance on fair use. Considerations include the inclusion of newly authored contextual materials required to make content accessible and available to students, so the sort of pedagogical context, um, being prepared to explain the pedagogic value of each selection, quantitatively and qualitatively appropriate use, derived from primary sources, from a range of sources, and with attribution. So these are starting to see the same sort of considerations show up across these situations, right? The hard case that they provide are examples that use an entire popular work, such as like a whole music video um, or film that may be more likely to be challenged because of um, power dynamics and sort of market viability. So users of that kind of content should be well prepared to explain their reasons for doing so. Um, need to be able to articulate why they needed to do that to accomplish their pedagogical goal. The last of these situations is repurposing content from existing educational materials. So the description here is observes that reinvention for its own sake isn't necessary, and that in some cases drawing on existing materials is aligned with copyright law. There's a whole category of educational or instructional content that isn't generally thought of as course materials, such as equipment operation manuals. The code cites that as an example. So use of excerpts in teaching might be transformative and therefore fair. Similarly, there are presumably huge volumes of textbooks and their like that have outlived their commercial viability but remain protected by copyright. The code suggests that chapter structure from a once popular biology textbook, for example, or using a problem set from an out of print math text um, that might be fair. In both of these examples, the amount used is negligible as a portion of the whole, and that include content that isn't subject to copyright protection, such as the math problem here on the slide. That's an unprotected fact. So the principle is that fair use supports selective incorporation of elements from sources which are not currently in wide use as course materials. Considerations include an assessment of the protectability of the content, and the organization or coverage. So like de minimis or trifling use might be relevant. A focus on the pedagogical value of incorporated items inserted and the ability to justify that use, avoiding market substitution, and utilizing a range of source work. So if you needed math problems, for example, the more works that you can source those problems from, the better, rather than pulling whole problem sets from a single book. The hard case notes that uses are only uses that are only moderately transformative may be fair if they don't serve as market substitutions. So if there are licensing mechanisms for bits and pieces of books, that might caution against fair use. That's going to probably be more relevant for books that remain market viable. So if you were looking at a math textbook from the late 70s, that might not be relevant because there may not be a licensing mechanism for it. So I see we're getting close on time, and I want to make sure I can answer questions, because usually around these topics there are some questions. So the last part of the code is signaling fair use. Attribution is important to OER and to open licensing and in the academy more generally. So when an insert is used in a Creative Commons licensed resource, in most cases, providing attribution is a requirement of the license. Like if you're using a CC licensed content, attribution is a part of all 6 of the primary licenses. So the lack of an attribution on an insert might cause confusion. Does that belong to the author? Is it subject to the open license of the whole work? Where did it come from? Who owns it? For someone making an adaptation, those are important questions to consider. So while attribution is not required by copyright law, it is widely considered a best practice among the open education community and for the purpose of clarity and for downstream users such as adapters. And the code suggests 3 methods for signaling fair use. Indirectly, sort of at the beginning of something, that says, unless otherwise indicated, third-party uses are included on the basis of fair use in the code. And then users have to kind of like take that fact from the beginning and apply it throughout. The direct method, which is the one I've used in these slides, is to annotate each object, each insert. This image from wherever it comes from is included on the basis of fair use as described in the Code of Best Practices for Fair Use in OER. And then the third is a hybrid, a mixture of those two, an indirect acknowledgement in the beginning or in the front matter with a direct acknowledgement on inserts as needed. So I did the number 2 because it felt the most direct in this context, but that's not absolutely necessary. So, neither I nor I know the creators of the code, and I've seen them present on it and talk about it, and I've talked with them about it. We're not suggesting that we can do whatever we want. This isn't a scofflaw. The rights of creators are important and should be respected, but not to the exclusion of our ability to do things that the law permits. And so copyright law is inclusive of fair use, and creators' rights must be balanced by user rights in limited circumstances as articulated in the law. So the code seeks to nuance our understanding of the role of fair use in OER to enable us to critically create better OER that better meets learning objectives, better meets your needs as instructors, and better meets the needs of students who are the students you're teaching. So I hope this is useful. I would strongly encourage you to access the code and give it a read. Save it as a reference in case you need to apply any of these concepts. The front matter and appendices have useful, thoughtful, clearly written sort of summaries of some of these issues that I think are helpful in and of themselves. And with that, I'll shut up and we can talk about whatever questions you might have in the remaining time. This session ends in 5 minutes, but I don't have to run away in 5 minutes, so I don't mind hanging out for a few extra minutes to chat.
Josh, I see a question in the chat that says a language and lit professor would like to create a reader utilizing fair use portions of other people's works as well as common domain works. Can he pull this together with his own commentary as CC work?
So is that, I'm skimming the, Okay, here we are. Laurel. Um, so keeping in mind that I'm not a lawyer and nothing I say can or should be construed as legal advice, and I can't make this decision for you. Individuals have to make their own decisions, and sometimes your university might have policies or rules that they expect instructors to follow. But a reader utilizing fair use portions of other people's works, as well as I would guess that common domain refers to the public domain, things that aren't protected by copyright, um, plus commentary. So the more that content can be drawn from the public domain, the less potential headache it will be. But I could imagine that in certain circumstances, um, the use of protected content in a reader might be necessary to accomplish the goals and the content of the course. So if we were applying the code of best practices for fair use in OER, that would be using inserts as so using inserts as objects of criticism or commentary, and then you would want to be careful about following the considerations and providing that pedagogical context, um, so that there is some transformation that is happening. Um, or we could look at including inserts for the purpose of illustration. So it might be that you're observing a phenomenon that is present in that sort of literature, and then including excerpts that illustrate that point. But I think you would be cautious. I mean, their hard case is the the reader, and I think that has something to do with the licensing mechanisms that already exist. So like when Norton puts together an anthology of work that's protected by copyright, a lot of those anthologies, they're using public domain content and then adding scholarly apparatus to it and selling it for $80. But a lot of them um, are based on um, copyright protected content, and they're licensing permit. They're working with the rights holders to license that permission because they're engaging in a commercial operation. um, so I think that if I were making that decision, I would proceed with caution and only use what I absolutely needed to accomplish the goals of the course, and only as much as was absolutely necessary and justified in doing so. So if a paragraph will get the job done rather than an entire essay, I would not distribute the entire essay. I would limit it to exactly what is needed to accomplish that goal. So that's a woozy answer, but like I just can't if you were at KU and asked me the same question, this is the way I always have to frame them: is I can't say yes or no. I would point you to the code as some sort of community understanding and encourage you to apply it and to think critically about it and be prepared to explain why you've chosen to do what you've chosen to do.
Josh, I'm not really seeing any other questions at this time.
Someone asked for a link in the chat, and that got
I
posted.
put the link in there for you.
Thank you. Yeah. So, I do want to make sure that I thank Susie, who drove through snow and ice this morning to get to her office so that she could do this, which I appreciate. And then the planning committee of the conference has put a ton of work into setting this up, and I think we all owe them gratitude for doing that. And thank you all for taking the time to come chat about this thing. I hope this was useful and helpful.
Well, I have 10:40 and it doesn't look like there's new questions coming in, so I'm going to stop the recording and we will end the session. Thank you, Josh.
Great. Thank you.